It was 11:47 in the morning, May 29th, 1943. Captain James Hartwell tightened the strap of his oxygen mask and looked out across the airfield at RAF Alconbury. The wind carried the metallic scent of aviation fuel, the hum of cyclone engines warming up, and the nervous laughter of ground crew pretending not to be afraid. On the tarmac sat a bomber, unlike any other in Europe. A B-17 that no longer carried bombs, a fortress rebuilt to destroy. They called it the YB-40, the Flying Destroyer, 16 50-caliber machine guns, 11,000 rounds of ammunition, armor plates thicker than anything Hartwell had flown before. It weighed 4,000 pounds more than a normal flying fortress and felt twice as heavy just sitting there. The mission sounded simple. Escort the main formation to Saint-Nazaire, cover them as they drop their bombs, and bring them home alive. But there was a catch, one that no engineer could calculate. Once the bombers had released their payloads, they became lighter, faster. The YB-40 would stay heavy, slow, and alone. Still, to the men watching from the flight line that morning, it looked like salvation. After months of bloody missions, after seeing friends vanish in fireballs over France, a bomber with this much firepower seemed like the answer. As the engines roared to life and the runway shimmered in the midday heat, someone muttered, "Now that thing can fight back." They didn't know yet that the YB-40 would fight harder than any bomber before it and still lose. Because sometimes in war, the difference between success and failure isn't courage, it's physics. And on that spring day in 1943, Captain Hartwell was about to discover what happens when ambition outweighs airspeed. The spring of 1943 was a season of loss. The 8th Air Force was bleeding over Europe, one mission at a time. German fighters had perfected the art of interception. Messerschmitt, 109 seconds, dove through bomber formations like hawks through pigeons. Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds, attacked head-on from 12 o'clock high, the one angle the flying fortress couldn't defend. Without long-range escorts, bomber crews called the return leg home the gauntlet. You'd drop your bombs over the Reich, feel a flash of victory, then turn for England, knowing half your friends wouldn't make it back. In the 3 months before May, the 8th Air Force lost 173 B-17s. That was more than 1,600 airmen gone. To the men designing America's war machines, those numbers weren't just tragic, they were unsustainable. So the Army Air Forces did something radical. If fighters couldn't escort bombers all the way, then bombers would have to escort themselves. At the Douglas plant in Tulsa, engineers stripped a standard B-17 down to its bones. They tore out the bomb racks, replaced the bombardier's station with a brand new twin 50-caliber chin turret, added a second dorsal turret behind the radio room, mounted twin guns in the waist, cheek guns on both sides of the nose, and another pair behind the cockpit. By the time they were finished, the aircraft looked less like a bomber and more like a gunship. 16 Browning M2s, bristling from every angle, 11,275 rounds of ammunition on board. The engineers smiled and called it the YB-40. It sounded invincible, but on paper, there was already a problem. All those guns and armor pushed its weight past 68,000 pounds. That made it heavier than the bombers it was supposed to protect and far slower once they dropped their payloads. Test pilots warned about the imbalance. They said it felt like flying with a brick strapped to the tail, but the engineers waved off the complaints. The math looked good enough. The brass wanted results, and quickly. The 92nd Bombardment Group received the first YB-42s in early May. They assigned 7 crews for the first combat test. Hartwell got aircraft 42 to 5,738. His crew called her Hedgehog. When he ran his hand across the gun barrels before takeoff, the metal was cold, smooth, perfect. He didn't know that perfection would soon become his enemy. By 1:25 that afternoon, the first YB-40 engines thundered to life at Alconbury. Hartwell's crew checked their turrets, their feeds, their oxygen lines. At 1:50, the tower cleared them for takeoff. Hedgehog rumbled down the runway, 16 guns, 4 engines, and a prayer. 168 bombers followed behind. Destination: the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire. Target time: 4 o'clock. The sky over the English Channel shimmered with contrails. Inside Hedgehog's fuselage, the men were sweating despite the cold. "Feels like we're dragging an anchor," one gunner muttered. He wasn't wrong. The YB-40 climbed at half the normal rate. By the time they hit 20,000 feet, the main formation was already edging ahead. Still, spirits were high. The crew believed they were flying history, the first bomber designed to fight back. What they didn't know was that this experiment in the sky would prove something no one wanted to admit: that sometimes more guns don't make you safer. Sometimes they just make you slower. By 3:30 that afternoon, the French coast appeared ahead, a jagged grey line beneath the bomber stream. Flak bursts blossomed over Guernsey, each one blacker and closer than the last. Hartwell adjusted the throttles, feeling the vibrations ripple through the yoke. Hedgehog's engines strained harder than he'd ever heard. In the waist compartment, Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney gripped the twin .50 calibers and muttered, "Feels like flying with the brakes on." The radio crackled reports of German fighters scrambling from airfields near Rennes, 12 o'clock high. Exactly where the old B-17s were blind, but the YB-40 wasn't blind anymore. For the first time in the war, a bomber could fight back head-on. At 4:02, the main formation reached Saint-Nazaire. Bombs dropped cleanly through broken cloud cover. Explosions shimmered in the harbour below. Then came the moment no one had planned for. The standard B-17s, now lightened by their bomb loads, began to climb and accelerate. Hedgehog didn't. Hartwell shoved the throttles forward. The manifold pressure needles jumped. The engines screamed. Still, the airspeed held steady at 148 miles per hour. The formation ahead slipped away first by a mile, then 3, then 4. The flight engineer, Tech Sergeant Paul Morrison, climbed down from the top turret and checked the gauges. Number 3, cylinder temperature deep in the red. He throttled back, but it barely helped. Hartwell knew what that meant: slower still. From the waist, Delaney's voice came through the intercom. "Contrails, 4 o'clock high, 8, maybe 10. Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds. Hunting stragglers." The crew went silent. Each man turned to his gun. The first attack came fast, a flash of grey diving from the sun. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Raymond Kack, fired first, his tracers arcing through the sky. The German pilot broke left, never fired a shot. The next two came head-on. The chin turret opened up 2 .50 calibers, spewing 2,000 rounds per minute. The lead fighter burst smoke, rolled inverted, and plunged toward the channel. "Got him!" Delaney yelled. For 6 minutes, it worked exactly as designed. Every attack broke off early. The air around Hedgehog shimmered with spent brass, the smell of cordite and oil. But victory had a cost. Fuel was running low, 800 gallons more than briefed. The heavier frame burned through it like wildfire. Now, they were 6 miles behind the formation. Alone. The next attack didn't break off. 3 Focke-Wulfs, from 3 directions: high right, low left, dead ahead. The sky erupted in tracers. The aircraft shuddered as cannon shells ripped through the right wing. A hydraulic line burst, spraying fluid across the waist window. "Landing gear's gone!" Delaney shouted. Morrison ran his gloved hand across the cockpit floor, slick with oil. Number 3 engine was running hot enough to melt itself. Still, Hartwell kept flying straight. The YB-40 couldn't dodge, couldn't climb, couldn't run. All it could do was fight back, and somehow it survived. By the time they reached the channel, Hedgehog's engines coughed black smoke. The formation was a ghost on the horizon. But behind them, two German fighters burned in the water. For the first time, a B-17 had outgunned the Luftwaffe, but not outflown it. By the time Hedgehog reached open water, the sky behind her had gone quiet. The formation was gone 8 miles ahead, vanishing specks over the channel. Hartwell's crew could still see faint contrails, curling white threads that meant safety and distance. But in the quiet, another sound grew faint, rhythmic, mechanical. Engines. Behind them, two dark shapes emerging from the haze, Focke-Wulfs again. But this time, the German pilots weren't attacking a bomber stream. They were stalking two lonely gunships, struggling through the sky. Over the radio, Captain Richard Hayes's voice broke through static. YB-41 falling behind. I'm forming up with you, Hedgehog. Now there were two YB-42s, two flying fortresses turned gunships, each slower than the other. Together, they looked powerful, 32 guns bristling, arcs of overlapping fire. But both were gasping for airspeed, guzzling fuel faster than they could calculate. Morrison checked the gauges again. They had 70 minutes of fuel left to cross the channel. Hartwell nodded. "We'll make it," he said. But in his gut, he wasn't sure. The Focke-Wulfs kept their distance, circling like wolves around tired elk. They knew the YB-40S couldn't run, couldn't climb, couldn't turn. At 5:22, two Messerschmitt 109 seconds appeared from the sun, diving at 6 o'clock high. The tail gunners called out the intercept, range 400 yards, closing fast. The German pilots opened fire first. Cannon shells tore through Hedgehog's tail section, the entire fuselage shuddered. Kak, the tail gunner, saw his own tracers vanish into black smoke. One shell exploded 2 feet behind him, ripping through the stabilizer. The control cables whipped free, vibrating like metal snakes. Hartwell felt it instantly. The yoke went soft, the tail was barely responding. Morrison crawled back, flashlight in hand, checked the cables. "Elevators are still attached," he shouted. "Trim tabs jammed solid. You'll have to fight her in." And that's what Hartwell did, hands locked, shoulders burning, pulling the yoke like it was welded to concrete. Ahead, Hayes's YB-40 opened up dorsal guns, spitting tracers in a rolling curtain of fire. The combined firepower of both aircraft filled the sky. The Germans broke off, climbing back into the sun. For a brief moment, silence again. Only the engines, one coughing, one overheating, one praying. Then, salvation. 4 P-47 Thunderbolts appeared from the northeast, their wings glinting silver in the low light. Escort fighters returning from Belgium, they'd heard the radio distress calls. The Thunderbolts dove straight through the Messerschmitts, scattering them back toward France. No dogfight, no chase, just a silent, wordless rescue. One of the P-47 pilots waggled his wings as he passed. For the first time all day, Hartwell let out a breath. They were going home. But as the white cliffs of England came into view, so did the truth. The YB-40 had done its job, it could fight. But it couldn't fly with the rest. Its firepower had made it too heavy, too slow, too thirsty. It was, as Hartwell later said, a gunship that became its own target. At 6:18, Hedgehog landed at Alconbury, barely holding together. Right main gear lowered manually, 17 bullet holes, hydraulics gone, trim jammed. Colonel Reed was waiting. He didn't need a report. He just asked, "Well, Captain, what's your verdict?" Hartwell climbed out, still shaking from the fight. He looked at the colonel and said the 3 words that ended the YB-40's future: "It can't keep up." Colonel Reed's report hit command desks within hours. The verdict was blunt: effective defensive firepower, operationally unviable. But the engineers didn't throw the idea away. They dissected every sortie, every combat film, every gun camera frame. And buried inside that mountain of disappointment, they found one perfect detail: Every time a YB-40 fired head-on, the attack stopped. German fighters that had once raced fearlessly toward bomber formations were now breaking off early, sometimes before they even fired. The reason sat right under the nose, the Bendix chin turret. It was elegant in its simplicity. 2 50 caliber Brownings mounted below the cockpit, electrically powered, remotely aimed from the bombardier's position. It could traverse left and right, elevate smoothly, and most importantly, fill the one gap every Luftwaffe pilot had been exploiting since 1942, the 12 o'clock high blind spot. Before the chin turret, frontal defense came from 2 cheek guns pointing diagonally outwards. Their fields of fire didn't overlap. German pilots flew straight through the gap, unleashing 20mm cannon fire into the cockpit and nose. Crews called it the suicide lane. But now, with the Bendix turret, that lane vanished. The bombardier could track a head-on attacker like a moving target on rails, press the trigger, and 2 streams of tracers converged at 400 yards. The engineers at Wright Field realized what they were seeing. Yes, the YB-40 had failed as an escort, but it had quietly produced a weapon that changed the geometry of air combat. By September 1943, Boeing incorporated the Bendix Model A turret into production. Douglas fitted it to the last 86 B-17 FDLs coming off the Long Beach line. Crews immediately noticed the difference. On missions over Gelsenkirchen, 12 head-on attacks were logged. 10 German fighters broke away before reaching firing range. The 2 that pressed through were both hit. For the first time, bomber crews recorded 0 losses from frontal attacks. The data was irrefutable. Loss rates to 12 o'clock assaults dropped from 12% to 3%. In engineering meetings, someone joked, "We built a flying failure but a perfect nose." Soon, the definitive B-17G rolled out of Seattle, Wichita, and Burbank with the chin turret as standard equipment. It became the hallmark of the Flying Fortress, the feature that turned slaughter into survival. Each new G model carried not just the turret, but 2 other lessons from the doomed gunship: staggered waist guns that stopped gunners from colliding, and the redesigned Cheyenne tail with its wide windows and improved arcs of fire. 3 innovations born from 1 failed aircraft. The YB-40 had lasted barely 90 days in combat, but its DNA was now in every fortress that followed, a paradox written in rivets and steel failure, giving birth to perfection. By the winter of 1943, factories were producing more than 200 B-17Gs a month. Everyone carried that polished dome under the nose, quiet tribute to the bomber that couldn't keep up. In the skies over Europe, German aces began to notice. Those head-on runs that once guaranteed easy kills now ended in fire. Pilots whispered that the Americans had closed the blind eye. They were right. By early 1944, the B-17G had become the face of the American air war. You could spot one instantly: the silver fuselage, the twin tail, and that distinctive chin turret gleaming like armor under the nose. To most crews, it was simply the new model. Few knew it was born from a failure. At Boeing's Seattle plant, workers tightened the bolts on turret housings without realizing the design came from a program that had been scrapped just months before. In Wichita, Tulsa, and Burbank, assembly lines turned out hundreds of new flying fortresses every month, sleek, balanced, lethal. None of them carried the name YB-40. But all of them carried its lessons. The numbers were staggering. 8,680 G models built before war's end, each one safer, faster, and more defensible than any B-17 before it. In just 6 months, frontal losses dropped by more than 70%. Crews who once died in droves over Bremen and Berlin now stood a real chance of making it home. Statisticians later estimated that the Chin turret alone saved 2,300 bomber crews. That's more than 23,000 men who lived because one experimental gunship couldn't keep up. But the YB-40's influence went beyond the nose. Inside the waist section of every B-17G, gunners had space to breathe. Earlier models forced them to stand directly opposite each other, elbow to elbow, constantly colliding during combat. The YB-40 engineers had quietly moved one gunner's station forward 30 inches, staggered waist guns. Simple, brilliant, life-saving. It allowed uninterrupted tracking, longer bursts, fewer jams. Then came the Cheyenne tail, redesigned after combat feedback from Hartwell's crew and others. Wider glass panels, smoother gun mounts, better armor. A tail gunner could finally see low 6, the deadliest blind spot in the old fortress. 3 changes: chin, waist, tail. Together, they formed the backbone of the definitive B-17. Yet history forgot the origin story. When museums displayed their gleaming flying fortresses decades later, the plaques listed armament, bomb load, missions, but never mentioned the YB-40. Not a single aircraft survived intact, no restoration project preserved. 1. The 12 prototypes were stripped for parts, used as trainers, or scrapped quietly before war's end. All that remained were fragments, blueprints, a few photographs, and stories told by men who flew them. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, James Hartwell read the news of new B-17 models entering service. He smiled, not with pride, but with quiet understanding. He'd seen how progress was forged through trial, error, and loss. The irony was almost poetic. The YB-40 was built to protect others, and in failing, that's exactly what it did. Every improvement that came after every bomber that made it home carried a trace of its spirit. Because in war, not every victory comes from success. Sometimes failure lights the way forward. December 1943. The winter wind rolled over the hard stands at RAF Alconbury, carrying the smell of oil, frost, and distant engines warming for dawn sorties. Captain James Hartwell, now a training officer, stood watching a line of newly arrived B-17Gs. Fresh paint, fresh crews, men half his age walking around the aircraft, tapping on the metal, pointing at the new nose turret, the one gleaming just below the cockpit. He heard one of them ask, "Where'd this thing come from?" Hartwell smiled faintly. He could have said Boeing or Bendix. Instead, he said, "From an airplane that couldn't keep up." And the young crews laughed. They thought it was a joke. But he wasn't joking. He'd flown that airplane. He'd watched it fall behind, engine gauges in the red, fuel draining away, German fighters circling like vultures. He'd felt the yoke fight against his hands for hours over the channel. And he'd seen what happened when those front guns opened fire, the shock in the enemy's dive, the hesitation, the breakaway. That was the moment the future of bomber defense changed forever. The YB-40 failed spectacularly, but it failed forward. It proved that innovation in wartime doesn't always arrive through triumph. Sometimes it limps home full of bullet holes, barely making the runway, teaching lessons written in smoke and steel. By the time the war ended, more than 8,600 B-17Gs had carried its legacy. The Chin turret alone had fired in anger on over 100,000 combat missions. Historians estimate it saved 23,000 men from dying in frontal attacks that once seemed unstoppable. 23,000 names that never appeared on memorial walls because of 12 aircraft that never made history books. Today, at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a beautifully restored B-17G called Shoo 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 Baby gleams under hangar lights. Visitors stand beneath its polished nose, admiring the turret cameras flashing, children pointing. There's a plaque beside it. It explains the armament, the engines, the bomb load. It does not mention the YB-40. It doesn't say that every inch of that turret, every inch of that protection, was born from failure. Hartwell never flew again after the war. He went home to Pennsylvania, raised a family, and rarely spoke of his missions. But when asked, years later, if the YB-40 was worth it, worth the cost, the risk, the men, he said quietly, every bullet hole in Hedgehog was a lesson. We just had to listen. Because history remembers success, but progress remembers failure. The YB-40 didn't win the war, it didn't even survive it, but it changed everything that did. The flying destroyer that couldn't keep up became the reason thousands of others could come home. Every mission, every dollar, every lesson was worth it.